that's about it.
Wonderful. Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our webinar, BAME LGBT+, Safe Space and Disclosure. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you all. You're all on time. It's brilliant. Thank you so much. Your facilitator tonight is Doreen, and I'm your host, Alison. And I just want to thank you very much for your participation tonight. I'll just quickly run through the house rules. This forum is really very much about collective action because all voices should be heard. And I truly believe that collective action, collaboration, and partnering are the way forward. Therefore, conversation must be constructive and a plan of action carried through to completion. However, the necessary steps required to achieve that mutual respect and understanding require some guidance and some learning. So we've chosen these themes with an emphasis on areas that the panel can inform on changes to regulation, procedure, circumstance, and we want to have a rounded understanding of our LGBT colleagues and the various ethnic groups and how the workplace and communities can gain further understanding and provide support and actively practice inclusion. Clearly, much work needs to be done in the workplace regarding equalities and acceptance and safe space and disclosure. And with that in mind, let's meet the panel. Let's begin. Let's start with Hafsa Stonewall.
Hi everyone, my name is Hafsa, my pronouns are she and her. I'm a client account manager at Stonewall, and I'll be talking through people of colour, our experiences as multiple identities within the LGBT community, and touching on a little bit of my experiences as well as a queer Muslim or a queer person of faith, and how that's been both in my sort of religious circles and also in the wider LGBT community. Are we going in order or?
Oh, this is no, please go oh yes, please, yes. Rob, could you introduce yourself, please? Rob.
Okay, yeah. I'm Rob, and it's a real pleasure to be here. It's a sign of the times, really, that you can sit in your front room and speak to loads of hundreds of people. It's what's wonderful. I'm in South London currently, where I live and where Blackout is based. I started Blackout on leaving the BBC and worked there in strategy after I'd run the Runnymede Trust, which is hopefully you've heard of as one of the big racial justice think tanks. But now I do what I love, in particular, because talking about racism can get pretty, well, after this summer, we've really experienced a tough summer talking about racism. Now I do my best to lift up Black queer men and help them do the talking. So I'll share more as we go on, but it's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Rob. Saskia.
Yeah, hey, hello. Thanks, Alison, for having me. Hello, everybody. Yeah, so I feel I always say I'm quite well entwined within the LGBTQ+ community. So I'm a trainer, LGBTQ+ inclusion trainer and consultant. I'm also like a Pride host, an interviewer. I have a radio segment that is for Shout Out Radio. It's also around positive promotion of the LGBTQ+ community. I'm an out and proud lesbian as well, and I'm also a mum, which I do throw in because I think that's important. Often, you know, it's getting better now, but often people think if you're from the LGBTQ+ community, you can't be a parent. So I've always like pushed that thing. I think it's quite important to shout out. But yeah, I'm excited because this is a conversation, you know, that we really need to be having, and I think it's about building confidence around language, around, like I say, having these conversations around race, around LGBTQ+ inclusion, how they again intertwine with each other. And yeah, I'm also learning as I go along, and I think that's important to say. You know, we're always learning. There's always new things. There's always new perspectives, new angles, new policies as examples. And so yeah, I'm here to be part of this conversation, and hopefully together we can answer some questions, well-needed questions, and yeah, just start working towards making changes, positive changes.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Saskia. Ade, yes, UNESCO Inclusive Policy Lab experts. I finally got it out.
Yeah, she got it right this time. Yay. Thank you, Alison, and thank you for inviting us all to be a part of this momentum. So I'm Adeolaya. I'll say during the, was it 1990? I was in local government, and that's when I got involved in LGBTI politics, so to speak, as a NALGO rep. I was a national rep, and then for LGBT, for the National Lesbian and Gay Steering Committee. And I also got involved, well, even prior to that, I was involved in Black issues. But subsequently, I kind of returned to the fold, so to speak, after a bit of a break, at which time I worked with Rob when he was with the Runnymede Trust. We're on the UK Race and Europe Network together. I think he chaired it at that time. I was the chair of Wiltshire Race Equality Council. And I currently am in Bristol, and been doing some research looking at people of African descent and the Sustainable Development Goals, which I will speak to you about in my presentation. So yes, I will say I'm not staff. I am an expert, credit of my research, and I suppose the interventions or participation in interventions, but not staff. Thank you. Cheers.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ade. Okay, right, let's get going because we only have a limited amount of time and we've got lots to get through. So, so without any further ado, Hafsa, you're up first. Doreen, are you ready with the slides? Excuse me. Oh, yes, Hafsa, you're doing your own.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
Hopefully everyone can see this.
Yeah.
Can you see my notes as well, or just the main screen?
We can see two screens. There's the main screen. There's some notes below. Says, yeah, hopefully everyone can see this. Can you see my notes as well at the bottom?
Oh yeah, those are just the live subtitles. I'm just making sure you can't see my little intro notes on the side.
Subtitles. Brilliant. Okay.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much. So I'll just get started. So my presentation today is just on intersectionality and inclusion for BAME LGBT+ people. I'll be using the terms BAME and POC, or people of color, somewhat interchangeably throughout this. So again, just reintroducing myself. My name is Hafsa, my pronouns are she and her. I'm a client account manager at Stonewall. Stonewall is Europe's biggest LGBT charity, and what we do is we work with organizations to improve LGBT culture, integration, understanding, and that's part of the job that I do. So just a brief outline of what we'll be going through today. In my presentation, we'll be talking about what privilege is and how that aligns with intersectionality, the experiences of BAME LGBT+ people, or LGBT people of color, the impact of COVID-19, the thing everyone wants to avoid talking about, but we kind of have to talk about, and what Stonewall does amidst all of this. So to start off with, we have an Audre Lorde quote. We love Audre Lorde. There is no such thing as a single issue struggle, as we do not lead single issue lives. I mean, I think that succinctly really explains what intersectionality is. We are multiple beings. We are not just one thing. When we walk into a room, we are several different things. And I think this complicated diagram kind of explain it a little bit more, but you can see in the middle it says me, and then it branches off into different aspects of who you are. For example, your age, your race, your gender identity, trans status, your faith, for example. And these are all always going to be aspects of you. They could be things you may not think are very, very important, or things that are constantly on your mind as part of what defines you as a person. Also, do drop a note in the chat if I'm going a bit too fast. I'm hoping the subtitles can keep up with me. Excuse me, sorry. So as we can see here, where it shifts very nicely, the impact of different aspects of your identity changes depending on what room you're in. So for example, in this space now, I'm likely to talk more about my identity as an LGBT plus person, and maybe less about my age, for example, because it's not really relevant to this conversation. And when you walk into certain rooms, there's going to be aspects of you that are more prevalent, whether you want them to be or not. Some people of color might have the experience of walking into the room. Could I maximize the slides? Yes, I can. Just bear with me one moment. Do you mean zoom in, or? Just bear with me, sorry. Just want to make sure you can all see it. Okay, is that big enough for you if you just want to do like a thumbs up in the chat? Cool, so just to continue, sorry. So again, like different aspects of your identity will be more relevant in certain situations. I think many people of color can understand that feeling of being in a room and being the only person of color in that room. And that sudden feeling of my race is very prevalent in this space, whether you want it to be or not. All of a sudden you stand out, and it can really weigh on your mind, and it can affect how people treat you unconsciously or consciously. So I feel like I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, as many of us may already be familiar with the term privilege, but I'll just talk through it now. But privilege is a special right or advantage afforded to a particular person or group of people. And everyone holds privilege. Everyone has some form of privilege. For example, myself, despite being a bi Muslim woman who's also disabled, who's also, you know, Indian, and all these adjectives, I'm also cisgender. I don't identify as trans, and therefore I have cis privilege. So when I walk into a room, I'm not thinking about my gender identity. I'm not having to think and consider if this space is accepting of me as a cis or cisgender person. Whereas someone who's trans may have to consider that when they walk into a space, if it's safe for them, if it's going to be accepting for them, whether or not their identity will be respected correctly and appropriately. And this is something we all have to consider in our lives. We need to recognize the privilege that we hold and use it to our advantage as well. I think there's sometimes two prongs to this issue of privilege. There's one where people don't want to admit that they have privilege. We sometimes see this in the LGBT plus community, where people might say, well, I've really struggled. So, you know, therefore I understand other people's struggles, so I don't see why or how I could have privilege. We sometimes hear this, for example, from white LGBT people who still hold that privilege of being white and not having to consider their race in a space when they walk in. That does not mean, however, that someone who is white or from another marginalized group can't also experience oppression or difficulties or be treated with bigotry according to their identity. It's just making sure that you're using what's available to you to kind of uplift the voices of others. And really just considering, you know, what advantage do I have in this space? What platform do I have where I can uplift someone else's voice? So when we talk about allyship, what does that really mean, and how does that align with privilege? Acknowledging your privilege is very, very difficult, especially if you've struggled a lot in life. It's difficult to say, actually, I do have this advantage. Maybe it's through your education or your experience or other aspects. It's really difficult to sit with that discomfort and say, actually, I have had this advantage. Actually, the world isn't equal, and that's something we need to fix, essentially, because the world has been designed in a very racist way. When we look at kind of organizational structure, people of color are put behind constantly. And because these structures have been designed by white people, for white people, for cisgender people, for heteronormative people, It's not designed for people like me. It's not designed for people from my community necessarily. And it's just making sure that we recognize that. Again, not to say that everyone with privilege is a bad person or anything like that. It's just making sure you recognize not everyone is going to have the same advantage as you. And it's really important to understand that. I think it's difficult sometimes when we talk about LGBT inclusion or people of color being included. We sometimes hear a response that it's, you know, everyone should pull themselves up by their bootstraps, or we're not working hard enough, or something like that. But when the world is built, in a way that does not include you, it's inherently more difficult to progress in that space. And it's important to recognize that and create opportunities for LGBT plus people, for disabled people, for people of color, and constantly consider where we have been left behind and how to bring us forward. So, oh, apologies, I should warn you, trigger warning for some upsetting statistics. So I'll just let you know when that's stopped. So hopefully you can see in the in the subtitles. I'll just give you a warning when I'm done talking about the statistics. But LGBT in Britain research has shown that 1 in 8 BAME LGBT employees have lost a job in the last year because of being LGBT, and that was compared to 4% of white LGBT staff. And 1 in 3 BAME LGBT people has experienced a hate crime or incident due to their sexual orientation or their gender identity in the last 12 months. And obviously, when we look at data, data doesn't lie. You can very easily say, well, perhaps that's a coincidence, but it would be disingenuous to do so when we can compare those stats with those of white LGBT people. We know that there's a disparity. There's quite a huge one there. And it's important to listen to that data and use that when we see that there's clearly inequality going on. As much as people like to propose a colorblind approach, the world is not colorblind. And it's somewhat naive to expect that to work, in my opinion. So 45% of BAME LGBT people attended LGBT-specific venues or events in their local community at least once a month, compared to 22% overall. This, of course, has been affected by COVID-19, which I'll touch on a little bit later. Half of BAME LGBT people have experienced discrimination or poor treatment from others in their local community because of their ethnicity. This number rises to 3 in 5 Black LGBT people, about 61%. It's important to note that people of color are not all the same. My experiences as an Indian Muslim woman are going to differ to a Black LGBT person. It's important to note that our experiences are not going to be the same, and that I, despite being a person of color, will not understand or be able to really experience what a Black LGBT person may experience. And again, that's another form of privilege, but another way I can uplift those voices as well and continuously educate myself. So I think this is the last of the triggering slides. But here it's talking about racism within the LGBT community. So there's actually some racial slurs here talked about, where people of color can be fetishized in communities for our identities, for being exotic. I've had that myself. It's pretty repulsive, but it happens quite often. It makes LGBT spaces difficult for us to take part in, because we're simply not included. When racism is so prevalent in a space that's meant to be inclusive, it immediately puts you off and thinks it makes you feel that there is no space that is feasible for you to enter. When I walk into my community space, I'm read as straight, and I hear very homophobic, biphobic, transphobic things. When I go into an LGBT space, I'm still read as straight, but then I also experience racism. And you don't have a space that's solely for an identity that looks like you. And that can be really difficult when you're exploring who you are as well, especially if you're very new to being out to yourself, if that makes sense, being out as LGBT. It can be really difficult to connect with your community when no one in that community looks like you or understands who you are. Okay, so trigger warning over. I'm not talking about any sort of harmful statistics now. I'm talking about COVID, so warning for COVID if you're sick of hearing about it. Okay, so the impact of COVID-19, I think, is quite obvious, but I'll run through it anyway. But the isolation from BAME LGBT community groups, as we saw earlier in the statistics, BAME LGBT people are more likely to attend events for community support, and this access is much more limited now because of COVID. There's even further limited access to healthcare, especially for trans and non-binary people. Access to healthcare has been very abysmal in this country, in all honesty. It's pretty terrible, but it's much worse now because it's more difficult to get into contact with your healthcare providers. And trans healthcare is not really seen or treated as a necessity or life-saving work, which is deeply unfortunate and should not be the case, but that's how it's perceived. And when someone is in an emergent situation regarding their trans healthcare, it's not treated with the same severity as someone who perhaps also has an emergent health condition, because there's a lack of education when it comes to trans healthcare. But that could be a whole presentation on its own. So thirdly, quarantine with unaccepting family members. So again, a lot of people are forced to quarantine with people who do not accept them. Again, this could be due to financial limitations or being stuck in a location. Some people are not able to travel. I live and work in Birmingham. We are in second tier of the Nando's tier. We are in lockdown. We are not allowed to travel. Thankfully, I'm not forced to quarantine with anyone, but if I were to, I would not physically be able to leave. And again, it's talking to people who maybe don't understand LGBT issues, who perhaps are dead naming you, as in not calling you your correct name, or misgendering you, using incorrect pronouns for you, to cause harm or not to cause harm. Regardless, it still causes harm. That's the impact that these behaviors have. I'm just seeing some comments that many BAME people have been digitally excluded, especially LGBT people seeking asylum. Absolutely agree. And digital divide is important to note when addressing rising inequality. Definitely agree. So this is what I was touching on with limited access to online services, especially for LGBT asylum seekers, or actually in the Black country, people with access to digital services is much lower in the Black country, in Birmingham, so those surrounding areas, compared to the rest of the UK, which is an interesting disparity, but something that's a huge problem right now. When most services have gone digital, it's even more difficult to access those services. So here we have the Happy May slides. This is my colleague May from work. She's our co-chair of our POC network, and we have the sad May for the awful stats, and then the happy May for the nice things. So Stonewall and LGBT inclusion in the workplace. What do we do, and how do we try and work on these issues? So first and foremost, we understand we do not have all the answers. And I think if anything, we need to sit back and say, actually, we'll never have all the answers, because as much as we try to have diverse representation, we're not always in specific groups. Like, despite me being a person of color, my work is not necessarily focused on BAME LGBT people. It's also part of the work that I do. So it's important that we continuously educate ourselves and educate the companies and organizations we work with to keep seeking that education and learning about different communities. So we're identifying key areas of focus. For example, I touched upon this before. So a lot of the work we've been doing is providing access to people, LGBT people in communities, things like funding or support, putting them in touch with organizations that can provide volunteer services, not just financial services, but if someone needs, for example, there's one client who needed some trucks to deliver some food. That was something we could arrange. Things like that. It's sort of, sometimes in this world, it's about who you know, and charities are usually quite well connected. So sometimes it's really useful to put those contacts out to people and help them. Calling in culture. The reason we don't call it calling out culture is because as much as it feels amazing to say to someone, look, you're awful and you need to improve, it doesn't work. When you want to bring someone on your side, you have to call them in. And as painful and difficult as it is, sometimes we need to put our ego aside and listen to what they have to say. And I'm not saying we need to agree with what they have to say, but we need to really let them in so they can see that our community is valuable, that our community is not just one large blob of scary people to them, but we are a wonderful, diverse, beautiful community. And we have a lot of stories, and there's a lot of weight to those stories and a lot of meaning to that we can share. So it's allowing for opportunities to bring those people in, to do so in a space outside of judgment and saying, you know, oh, you should know this by now. And sometimes I do feel that way, but at the same time, it's saying not everyone is at the same point I may be on my journey of education and exploration. And some people are starting at zero, and that's okay. And just educating them as they go ahead. Listening to BAME LGBT people. So again, just because I am a LGBT person of color doesn't mean I know all the experiences of all LGBT people of color, especially when it comes to the Black community, colorism within sort of my own Indian community as well. Faith intertwined with that as well. It's important to listen to communities outside of our own and those inside of our own as well, because we may have privileges that mean we don't necessarily connect with all aspects of our community. So it's important to keep listening and keep engaging and sit back with your own ego, as I said before, and just saying you will not have all the answers. And that's okay, because you should be seeking them continuously. Formulating impactful changes, which is very HR speak, but making that change actually happen. So instead of just going to communities and saying, organizations and saying, this is what you need to improve, we want measured targets. We want to go to an organization and say, this needs to improve. You should have this done within the next few years because such and such organization is doing it, or because this is how you best serve your workforce. You don't want people to leave you when you're not even meeting the bare necessities for what you should be offering people beyond their identities as LGBT people. It's more duty of care. If you're not providing access to people who are disabled, for example, but also for LGBT people in a way that makes them feel included, then you've already failed your employees in a way. And again, there's nothing wrong with starting from zero, but there needs to be some action done. There needs to be steps taken. So I'll touch really briefly on this, but one way we also do this is something called the Stonewall Workplace Equality Index. It's very long, but basically what we do is we go through 8 different aspects of your organizational structure, and then we work with you on those different structures to kind of improve everything across the board. Obviously, it's not foolproof, and we're continuously revising this. We have like a 3-year cycle where we review it. We've just come to the end of our last review cycle. But this allows us to see really in depth about aspects of your organization. Excuse me, sorry. So we look at things like policies and benefits. You know, are your policies inclusive? Have you thought about LGBT people? What we want to do is avoid vague statements like we are inclusive of everyone, because everyone says that. Are you actually including those communities? Are you actually thinking about them? Is it reflected in the most boring, dry policy that everyone still has to read when they join an organization? Because that protects employees when it comes around to them needing those same policies. The employee life cycle, which is sort of when the employee joins the company to when they're in the organization to potentially when they leave, just basically their whole journey within the company. What does that look like? Do they have access to LGBT support, to networks? Obviously, we go into much more depth. I'm just aware of time because when I run sessions on this, it's usually like 1 or 2 hours. So LGBT network groups, as it says, just sort of network groups available to employees. There's some organizations we work with, they don't have a network. So then we help them develop that network and then communicate out what that network does to people and kind of bring in LGBT people and allies to participate. Empowering individuals, this is where we go to communities and kind of empower people. We just did our Stonewall Youth Summit, which was amazing. We were talking to a lot of LGBT youth about their ideas to change the world, and it was fantastic. It's just sort of helping them make those ideas actually happen and make them come to fruition just by giving them the tools and sharing our resources with them for free.
First, you were sorry that we've gone over time.
Oh, sorry.
You there.
Yeah, I'll just leave it there then, but thank you all.
No, that's fine. We'll be able to come back to you in the Q&A.
No worries. Thank you very much.
Yeah, but that was brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you. it's very informative. Harm, the impact of COVID, limitations and access to services, inclusion, I think was one of the main messages throughout that presentation there, and how important inclusion is in the workplace. Rob Barkley, MBE and co-director of Blackout UK, welcome.
Thank you. And I've got a presentation as well. Thanks, Hafsa, because that was fantastic, and it's let me off the hook. I now can do what I'm better at, I think, and just talk about my specialist subject, which is Black queer men. And really, I tend to poke and provoke more than I do give information in such a brilliant way. So I hope people are willing to come with me on a bit of a journey. So I'm going to tell you a bit about why I run Blackout and what we're currently doing. Blackout, we bring together bi, gay and trans men of African descent right across the UK, at least we're trying to, and mobilise them to take a lead in building collective responses to the challenges that we face. Because we believe, and this is a quote from Joseph Bean from 1981, that black men loving black men is a revolutionary act. And I'll leave that with you, and we'll come back to that later on, but I want to just, I want that to percolate for a while, because it's really, it's really interesting how little we actually engage with the real people who we talk about in these groups. Often, and I'm feeling this particularly now because I'm right in the middle of completing a research project which hopefully will shed some new light on the lives of Black queer men in the UK. And I've been feeling that the stories that I'm hearing, the context and the depth and the texture of those stories is very rarely captured in our public discourse. And I think that in some ways is intentional. In some ways, if we really engaged with the texture of people's lives, I think we would have found it difficult today when those figures came out saying that Black people are 9 times more likely to be stopped than white people in the street going about their business, and that the police made 18,000 stops in the Met in London, made 18,000 stops, of which Section 60, which is probably the most kind of blanket provision that have in terms of stop and search. They made 18,000 stops and only 750 of them led to any further action. 4% of those stops led to an arrest. It feels to me like that's a crazy place for us to be in, for public servants to be spending our resources in that way, unless there is something else going on. And it just feels like if we thought about the texture of people's lives a bit more, rather than them as statistics, rather than them in terms of the proxy measures that we use to capture a sense of people's well-being, we might give a bit more pause and think a bit harder about what that really means for a young person who is stopped on that regularity, who's called out as different and threatening to the state in that way. Anyway, so that's one of my angry things that I'm angry about today. I should have said, by the way, that my pronouns are he, him, and I want. I think it's important that we start to use that kind of language because it's an act of solidarity. So back to the story of Blackout. We started in 2016, basically as a web platform, seeking to amplify our voices and marshal conversations between us about our lives, dreams, and aspirations. We described it then as coming out of the quiet. Many of us were happy in our identities, we're proud of who we are, but we found it incredibly difficult to be heard. In part because in the mainstream media, we were an exotic, hard done by niche minority, perfect for the soap opera cliffhanger or stuck in an eternal guess who's coming to dinner moment. Luckily, not everyone is as wonderful an actor as Sidney Poitier. To Black media outlets, we were fodder for the shock jocks, grist for the mill of attention-seeking controversialists, whether in a newspaper column, or from a church pulpit, or set to a catchy dancehall beat. In the LGBTQ media, we were tolerated, but unloved, maybe because the pink pound had missed us. Maybe because we're a reminder of the society's need for a reckoning with racism, and that agreeing that Black Lives Matter actually requires some action. So we began a conversation where we could define ourselves rather than be defined by others. And we had a great quote from Audre Lorde. But here's another one from her, where she says that if I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crushed up into other people's fantasies and eaten alive. And I think that's how we felt. Every time we tried to tell our story, every time we tried to express ourselves, we were told, "Oh no, you must be this thing and not who you are," and that becomes partly a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're only allowed to be one or two things, and therefore you live up to that, or you go through a kind of process of a real kind of struggle with identity and a real struggle internally with other people who share that identity. So we began this conversation just so we could define ourselves, and the response was amazing. So we found ourselves connecting with guys up and down the country, but it was overwhelming. The workload was too big to operate in our spare time. And we started conversations about, what was on TV, about Drag Race, obviously, and fashion, that seemed to then take a turn that required much greater urgency. For those of us who could, we had to do more to create something different. Because I'd find myself scouring through the newspapers for reports to confirm what the rumour mill was telling us. We were hearing stories of young men lost for want of companionship, a friendly ear, someone who understands what they were going through. Another one lost just to one more party, the next chill out with no chill. Now these stories were not easily categorizable, and because we could only be a couple of things, they rarely feature in the mainstream media. So I'd spent 25 years, I'm showing my age now. I'd spent the first 25 years of my career focused on changing big institutions. So I started with Oxford, started with the big ones. I went on to Parliament and then onto the BBC. Proudly, I received my MBE from the Palace as a result. But then in 2018, I felt ready to take a leap, not to focus on making white-led institutions more inclusive, but on directly supporting the Black community, my Black community, to be all it can be. And we became determined to intentionally build futures together and start making space for us. It's remarkable when you're in a minority, within a minority, how little time you can spend talking amongst yourselves, and how much time we'll spend almost in a kind of circle facing out. So you're constantly explaining, oh, we're like this because, or we do this in this way, but very rarely checking back in with each other. But what the conversation started to show us is that Black, bi, gay and trans men needed each other far more than I or my co-editors had initially realised. So a couple of slides ago, you saw the cover of the research report that I'm going to be putting out. And that goes through the data in a similar way that Hafsa did. It shows that as younger men, we're more likely than other Black men to be homeless, to suffer from poor mental health, and to experience severe alienation. We're much more likely, when compared to other bi, gay or trans men, to be living with HIV. We're more likely to be in precarious employment or underemployed, to misuse drugs or alcohol to cope. And then with weaker networks, fewer friends or family to turn to when in need, we're made more vulnerable to exploitation. As older men, we're more likely to be alone and often feel invisible and have high levels of loneliness. In part, that's a result of losing so many to the AIDS epidemic in the 80s. Almost every statistic that we could unearth pointed to the negative. Almost worse, it seems as if no one had been able to do much more than pick up the pieces, to administer sticking plasters, to dole out the antiretrovirals, or contact the next of kin. When help arrives, it's really welcome, but it's not always good help. Black queer men have been seen as a thing to be saved, as incapable of taking control of their own lives. And that actually, in the long run, becomes a further contribution to alienation and dependency. There have been occasions when I've disclosed my sexuality to be met with looks of pity. Wow, Black and gay, that must be doubly hard. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. So what we'll be doing at the end of this week and start of next is launching a campaign, really, a call to Black queer men to be there for each other, and for allies to come forward and offer support to that connection. So we can create some healthy spaces, that we can create hope rather than despair, and a stronger sense of pride. I pointed that maybe it's just a slide that's just gone. We launched the Blackout Hub. That's right, and that is a mobile app that now enables us to stay connected. And I think after a series of years and years of watching it from the board of Stonewall or the chair of the NAS project, we do a 6-month project and we think people would be fixed and then we move on. Okay, so we can, and we might overserve the same people over and over again. Actually, we need to be there for each other, and the technology allows us to do that much more easily. So we're now about 400 members strong. I've been working on this for a long time. I've never had 400 of us on a mailing list even. But we're 400 strong, and I think we can grow to the kind of 10,000 level that would include almost probably about 75% of our population in the country. And there we can start to offer mental health and sexual health, mentoring, employment skills, all the challenges that Black men have, we have. And the intersection that we're at, I think, compounds that or makes the resilience harder to create, because we're less connected to neighborhoods, we're less connected to communities, and there's often trauma in the teenage years, where people come out and are rejected, or have had really negative experiences. One of the kind of striking things I found in the research was that, and this is London, so it could well be a London thing, but I don't think it is. It's 80% of our respondents have never said hello to their neighbours. And I think that there's that kind of day-to-day psychological fear which you live with, which says, I'm just going to keep myself to myself. I'm going to keep this space really private to me, because I can't risk losing home or losing that kind of sanctuary that I have. But what does that do for somebody in terms of their day-to-day engagement with the people around them? To me, it's a real shame, because there's something really strong about community. So how we get to that point might require building some capacity, but it might also require building spaces where we learn to practice a sense of community and build our resilience up. The research I will share with you through Alison. Hopefully, it'll be ready to go out on Friday. He said, touching word. We're really seeing the benefits of this work, and I think it was just last month that one of our members said in an open meeting. We've been meeting on in Zooms largely. He said, hand on heart, if it wasn't for the fellowship that I found through Blackout, I don't know whether I would have made it through this year. And he was a successful exec in a large corporate who was internally in despair, but didn't let on. And I think there's lots of that kind of suffering in silence that happens. But it's really important, I think, for us, but also for the work that we will go on to achieve, that we start from what's strong. And there is so much strong amongst this group that's becoming a community, that if we can build those connections between them, we can respond to the kind of loneliness and the despair. I think the future looks pretty bright. Stop there.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Thank you. That was very informative. I didn't realize that the work that you're doing at Blackout UK also included gathering data. So I'm very much looking forward to receiving the results of the research project. Very much.
Yeah, happy to share it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much, Rob Barkley, MBE. So Saskia, welcome. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you for being here. And why don't you please introduce yourself?
Yes, I will.
And tell us your pronouns.
I have, yes. I've put it on my list there. But yes, Saskia, my pronouns are she, her. I am an LGBTQ+ inclusion trainer and consultant in schools and the workplace. I am also, as I mentioned earlier, a Pride host and an interviewer very much within our LGBTQ+ community. So I'm all about positive promotion of our community and how we can do that, whether we do that through events, whether it's through my radio segment, again, promoting the great work that people are doing within our community. But you know what, I think, as I said earlier as well, what was great to hear from Hafsa and Rob is it's really, this is all about us learning, isn't it? You know, you've got, even when you think you've got Stonewall and you've got Blackout UK, and they say we're still about learning. I mean, that just goes to show the importance of us listening and sharing and talking about our experiences and about what's changed, what hasn't, what needs to change. So yeah, so it's really nice to hear what people have to say so far. But yeah, that's what I do. I feel like I should have had a presentation. I feel a bit slightly left out.
Oh no, not necessary at all. I've got some questions for you, actually. What, I mean, you mentioned there that you're working in education, you know, and this, of course, this webinar is very much about the workplace and dealing with the challenges that are being faced in the workplace by various ethnic groups who are LGBTQI. So in your experience, what are employers doing, or what should they be doing to keep their staff safe
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately you want to make sure that this is working from top to bottom. So it's a safe space. I mean, a safe space, it should be for every employee to feel like they can be their true, authentic self. I think it's really important that, as I say, that goes across the board. So it isn't just sort of like a shiny surface thing they put on their job applications to say we are inclusive, you know, regardless of, you know, or inclusive of all 9 protected characteristics. It should be something where you go into an organisation, even if it's, I guess, maybe from interviewing stage, you know, it's good to show the diverse talent that you have within on the interviewing panel, looking about what is, you know, what is the inclusion policies. Does the organisation have employment resource groups? You know, they're not just giving us lip service, maybe around that pink washing. They should be creating safe spaces by showing you that, you know, talking to you as at the onboarding start, that from the very beginning, we are an inclusive organisation, but actually showing you, again, talk is cheap. You know, I want to know, are there, you know, are there employment resource groups? Are there network LGBTQ plus networking groups, BAME networking groups, women's groups, disability groups, whatever they look like? So I guess to start with, yeah, I mean, there's lots of things. I would always be checking the policies. I would always be looking at those policies. I would always be thinking about, again, visibility. Are they celebrating? How much of a community are they within their organisation? Are we celebrating different events, etc.? You know, so yeah. So I think maybe to start with, we could, again, it could probably be a whole show, but there's some pointers I'm looking out for.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said about the tick box, you know, just doing the bare minimum. I think, if we're going to be frank, I think a lot of employers do actually do that. They do the actual bare minimum, and I think there's a lot more that could be done. So, and one of those things is actually forming a relationship and communicating in a respectful way and from a place of knowledge with their staff. Who are LGBTQ and ethnic, also from an ethnic background. And also championing allyship. So with that in mind, bearing in mind that there are a lot of courses out there on reverse mentoring, which are also getting quite a lot of stick. Reverse mentoring is in some ways also being replaced with other forms of training now as being unvaluable or not as valuable as it used to be. So looking at allyship, what should employers be doing to be an effective ally? That's on one side. And on the other side, in your experience, how should one approach a manager or an employer about disclosing?
I think in terms of the allyship, it would be great. And sorry, one thing I should have added, which I didn't say, was of course having LGBTQ plus inclusion training, which is very, you know, key. Again, I think there should always be more around allyship programs as well. I've done some training recently with Hewlett-Packard Enterprise as an example, and they recently introduced an allyship program. And I think when we're talking about allyship programs, it's important to remember that allyship is for everybody because discrimination affects us all. So it shouldn't just be about one particular, maybe underrepresented group. So it shouldn't just be about LGBTQ plus. It shouldn't just be about BAME. It shouldn't just be about women. You know, it should be the understanding that we need allyship because we all need to work together to make positive change, to move, you know, to tackle discrimination and to move forward. So that's in terms of allyship. Yeah, I would say that's what you need to do. But you need to get people talking. You have to include, you know, before you even get to that, people need to be talking, understanding language, understanding that. So as an example for LGBTQ plus communities, people need to understand what languages, what terms are around sexual orientation and gender identity, because then that builds confidence. And when people have confidence in language, then they have better conversations, and then that opens up more, you know, awareness and education for people. And again, it breaks down those barriers of communication that may have been there before. And again, that helps building those, you know, those lines of those allyship support networks. And again, just to add to that, within the ERG groups, which I'm slightly digressing, but it is important, I feel like if they have them in work, when you have that in the workplace, it's important that they also connect with each other. So it's not just a separate, you know, a pride group, a women's group, actually all interlinked, because together you become stronger allies. You share your experiences, you share the support that you're receiving within the workplace. And then by doing that, again, that creates a better feel of community within the organisation, and strength and power, I think, you know. And I'm sorry, can you tell me the second part of your question, because I went a big off on there, the allyship.
Okay, unmute myself. Yeah, it was also from the individual's point of view, you know, how do you go about addressing disclosure with your manager or your employer? I mean, it's one thing from the employer's point of view as a manager to be an ally, but if your staff member doesn't feel comfortable or isn't in a space where they feel they can approach, you know, how do you as an individual approach disclosure?
I think it should always, I mean, it does vary. Unfortunately, it does vary depending on the organisation. It does depend on what support they have in place as it is. And as we've seen from even these previous presentations and conversations so far, not everyone is necessarily offering that support. And just what we know in today's society, not every organisation is, you know, we can talk about equality and diversity, but not every organisation is up there with it. It's where we like them to be. I think maybe, I guess, if you're talking about disclosure in terms of, let's say if it was like, I think you should be in an organisation where you can go to HR. You should be in an organisation where you can go to the champion, or you know, whoever that person is, who is your key person, and that whoever that key person is, you should be aware of them from the start, from an induction, from an onboarding, and that's where you should have that confidence to be able to disclose about anything that's confidential. Yeah, so I think hopefully that would be really where I would say to start. But you should always feel that you know, organisations don't want to have a grievance against them, do they? They want that, you know, they want to make sure that they are having, they should have these champions or HR support on board. And that's what I would say. I would say that's where you really need to go. If you feel that you can't disclose information to your manager, there's a problem anyway. So, you know, then I start thinking about, maybe are you with a union? Maybe are you, again, if there are employment resource groups that are specific to that issue that you're having, where you might need additional support for just to boost your confidence and get that back up, and know that, you know, they're there to help you as well. But I do think if you can't feel like you can disclose sensitive information to HR or to your manager, then I would maybe start thinking about making sure you are part of a union anyway, because there seems to be an issue with, you know, with that confidential and that relationship.
And starting your own group, perhaps there isn't that facility, that safe space within the organization, so maybe that it would be for you to then start that group within your organization and get that structure set, and then collectively approach.
Absolutely, because I do think that you know, fortunately we are seeing this, you know, more and more organisations are taking on the, you know, employment networking, employment resource groups. You know, it's all about you know, feeling that you, or having that confidence and knowing that actually you should, if you don't feel you have this in your workplace, you have the right to request it, and that is something that you should be able to do with HR. That's why they are there, to support that. And again, that's a real, you know, reflection on that company or that organisation if there's an issue around that. Where again, if you're in that kind of territory, then absolutely I think that you need to make sure that you are maybe with some kind of union, because it is up to, you know, it is around HR, it is their responsibility to make sure that there is that support in place.
Thank you, Saskia. We've had a comment in the chat from somebody who has said, well, what about if you're, across many different groups, like you're a person of color, you're from an ethnic group, and you are also LGBT plus, and you're disabled. Which network do you join?
Well, you join whatever one you feel like you want to. I think you really, because really, like Hafsa said, when we talk about intersectionality, because that's a good example of that. In certain areas or certain rooms, certain events, certain spaces, you might feel like you identify and feel more confident or not in those areas. So personally, if you are someone who, as an example, identifies as, female, person of colour with a disability, and they've all those, why not join all of them? Because again, you're networking, strengthening numbers, again, that's allyship in itself, learning and supporting each other with those networks. So I would say join whatever ones you want to, but actually encourage you to join them all,
Yeah, in theory, yes, but in reality, they probably wouldn't be allowed to have that much time off to go to network meetings. But I know what you mean, and I'm sure they do as well. It's interesting that you mentioned intersectionality, because looking at the trans community, non-binary as well, what are the barriers for LGBT or gender neutral? What kind of barriers are they facing? And in your experience, if we could probably make this the last question, because we're running out of time now.
The barriers to transgender and gender non-conforming, gender diverse communities. What are the barriers?
Yes.
This is why it is really important. Fortunately, language is moving forward. People are more confident in feeling they can come out. I know there's obviously statistics show that discrimination is absolutely still rife, and it's not where it should be by no means. But we are seeing more and more people coming out in the workplace around their gender identity. On top of that, though, and a prime example was I was on a contract, and one of the managers said, "Oh, I noticed somebody put their pronouns. They put she, her on the signature sign off." They said, "Why did they do that? What does that mean?" And I thought, well, that's interesting. So it's like, it just goes to show that there isn't still enough education awareness around the journey that trans and gender non-conforming people have or go through. I think there isn't, it's not even just about understanding what pronouns mean in terms of barriers and language and support for whether, as an example, trans people are, when they are transitioning, there's an assumption that every trans person will have surgery, but that's not always the case. There's always different levels of transition that they go through. Understanding the importance around maybe if you have gender neutral toilets, if it's a uniformed organisation, is there a gender neutral uniform? There are lots of barriers, but what's important to know is that actually they can really be very easily overcome. And really, that's why language is so important, because when you're looking to work and support trans people and non-binary people, gender non-conforming people, we are all human. It's just about an understanding terminology, so we have confidence in conversation. Confidence in conversation builds your management, because management don't always know. Like we've said in this, we are learning. They should know. They should be absolutely taking steps to make those changes and make sure they do understand what the correct inclusion is. And that's where training comes into place. That's where putting in support plans and speaking to the trans people or the gender non-conforming people, hear their stories, hear their experiences. What can we do to help you? It's again that communication will help overcome those barriers. Of course, having your policies updated to say that, given clear examples, as Hafsa mentioned earlier, it isn't just about going, we are an equal opportunities organisation. It's about, I want to see clear examples of what we will not tolerate. We don't tolerate homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, what that looks like. So there's many barriers like that they can overcome. Really it's talking about it. And again, that comes into allyship. You're an ally, do your own research, but have the conversation with the people who are going through those experiences. Put that training in place with your teams, put that training in place with your, through HR, make sure it's regular, updated training. so that people, again, have that confidence. But also, for the individual, it's about doing it at their pace. You know, just because a trans person may disclose to you that they're trans, that doesn't mean you go and tell the whole. It's not open. It's not. But you know, people do. They will take that on board. I've unfortunately had those cases.
Oh, okay. Right. The host has spotlighted your video to everyone. Would you like to unmute? Thank you. I'm unmuted. Right. We seem to have frozen. Is everybody back? We froze there for a second.
Yep.
Is everybody back? Okay, brilliant. Saskia, thank you very much for that. I'm not sure what happened there. She's frozen and she's just disappeared off of my screen completely. So she came, she delivered, and she has gone. My goodness. Okay. So without any further ado, Ade, thank you so much for waiting so patiently to deliver your piece. Thank you so much. We can't wait to hear from you. Thank you. Please. Oh, yeah. Doreen, brilliant. Yes. Doreen has your slides up. Yeah. Thank you very much. Welcome, Ade.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alison. I was just reflecting, it's 30 years ago, I was the Black member on the Lesbian and Gay National Steering Committee for NALGO, which was the biggest local government union at the time in the country. So it's wonderful to be here 30 years later to see old faces and new faces. We have made progress. There have been some, you know, we've moved back, but anyway, here we go. So my presentation, next slide, please. I'll start my presentation with, next slide, please. Yeah, you know, looking back at Langston Hughes, Harlem Renaissance, BAME LGBT man, QI man, and the energy from the people who had that struggle even before we were, you know, we took it on. So let's take a minute and remember them. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I'll be looking at allyship and intersectionality, the impact of COVID-19 on access to local support here in Bristol, where I currently live, having lived in London. Sorry, guys, bye. IDPAD and the 2030 agenda, and then we can have the Q&A after that, if there's any questions. Next slide, please. So I'm a researcher at UE Bristol, where we have 5.2% of the staff self-identified as LGBTQI or other, compared to 4.7 in 2018. 0.4% are transgender, and a number of BME LGBTQI individuals, including UE Bristol staff, have been recognized by the Bristol Post Pink List for the work done with local communities. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is all about UE, because UE has been on Stonewall's list for a while. So we have an increase in terms of BAME. The staff percentage of staff has increased from 3% 16 years ago to 11% currently. Still, there's only about, let's say, roughly 9% of senior staff are BME. And most of BME staff are on fixed term or temporary contracts, which is something I've heard happens in other universities as well. Seems to be something where, you know, get a lot of BME staff in representing permanent employment. So only approximately 166 of US staff population self-identify as Black. or of African descent in comparison with 85% of white. I make that distinction because, as you see as I go along, that my research is around people of African descent. So even though I do mention BME a lot, because a lot of statistics are only in terms of BME, sadly, I do prefer statistics which cut down to Black or African descent, because that's where, as I think Rob and also Hafsa alluded to, you know, a lot of disproportionate inequality is happening. Next slide, please. Right, so that's yours truly at Pride last year. UE, as I said, is very proactive. So they sponsor, you know, they sponsor the disabilities section for Pride, and they've always been a big sponsor of Pride. They have an LGBTQ allies network for staff, which I'm a member. And you don't have to be LGBTQI to join, from all faculties and services, just to demonstrate solidarity and allyship. And I will say it was a very pleasant day. It was my second Pride in Bristol. And, you know, I'm really glad that I did do it. As you can see, Bristol, yeah, so they've been Stonewall Diversity Champions for 8 years. I attended Stonewall 1 year. And to be fair to the university as well, bear in mind there are 2 universities in Bristol. This is not University of Bristol, this is UE Bristol, University of the West of England, Bristol, which is the other one. So UE Bristol also supports organizations like Equity, which is on campus, but is around BME, Consciousness, Nilari, which provides a lot of support to students, BME, and LGBTQI, and African Voices Forum, of which I'm a board member. Next slide, please. So that was a statement made by the Equality and Diversity Manager, which she was happy that for me to share with you. And I think this ties in with the other people have said. It's not just about the labels, as I think we used to call them somewhere in the 90s or noughties. It's not about the labels anymore. We have to recognize we're all different identities. We're all, you know, blah, blah, blah. We're all a mixture of a whole lot of things. And it's being inclusive, allowing that person to flourish. Yeah. And leaving no one behind, which is, I'll come to later, that phrase. Next slide, please. So here we are, wake up call, hazard, COVID-19, which if we don't do something about it, it could become a huge disaster. Next slide, please. So say at UE, and not only UE, other universities, as I'm sure, and not only universities, I'm sure all of us have been impacted one way or another by the legislations which are in place, which if you don't comply with, you can be arrested. Next slide, please. I'm happy to share those slides. Next slide, please. Thank you. National defenses as well. So in terms of travel and so on, those slides are just really to give you an idea that it's legit. It's not just a couple of police people walking around. There is hardcore legislation there. And if you breach it, they have got the right to lock you up, because it's a defense so that the hazard and exposure to the hazard does not become a disaster. Next slide, please. Thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what has been the impact on our communities? Right, so your challenges here in Bristol, nothing. I've been one of the organizations that I work with, OTR VIP. The statement is the government has put nothing in place specifically for LGBTQI communities to address potential discrimination in healthcare settings, which is huge, as some of the previous speakers have alluded to, or to address concerns, say, you know, if somebody's trans, passes away, how is that managed and respected? I think it's clear that it probably might not be. And some of the responses locally have been that Voice and Influence Partnership, which I'm a panelist for, they allocated funding to various local organizations, including Kiki, which is the local organization which works with BME LGBTQI community, and Freedom Youth, which more around the youth, who of course, as has also been alluded to, are extremely vulnerable. LGBTQI youth are extremely vulnerable to domestic violence, mental health, and homelessness at this time. So we are singing from the same hymn sheet across the country. Next slide, please. Thank you. Intersectionality. Now, pre-COVID, Bristol had disproportionately high BME unemployment rates, educational low attainment, modern day slavery, and slave-related practices all happen here still. Post-COVID, or well, I can't say post, we're in it. There has been an increase in Black males detained in mental health institutions. I've heard some very horrible stories. There's been an increase in BME LGBTQI seeking support, especially around mental health issues. There's been an increase in domestic abuse and hate crime reporting against LGBTQI youth. And of course, as has been said earlier, our vulnerabilities to arrest, poverty, etc., as Black folks. Something ran through my mind when I was speaking and I forgot what it was. Oh my gosh, it was important. Hopefully it comes back. But yes, that's a proud Black lesbian in New York. So yeah, right across the world, we deserve to live. So we gotta stand together. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so recommendations, and this kind of falls in line with what I think Saki was saying, the previous speaker was saying. So we need systemic, we need social, and we need reparative justice. Because we're not only LGBTQI people, we are, especially for those of us who are people of African descent, we still suffer the trauma of slavery and colonialism, and some other minorities also suffer similar traumas. And not only the trauma of what's happened in the past, but the current representations are the same. I'll try and go quickly because I'm looking at the time. So I've some of the normative frameworks, which I think we can find those responses are the Agenda 2063 for people of African descent, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which all state parties across the world have signed up to, and also the International Decade for people of African descent. I won't say much about knowledge exchange because some of the previous speakers here have highlighted it as something important going forward, and I agree 100%. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the International Decade for People of African Descent was proclaimed in 2015. So we're coming up towards the end of it, and the thematic objectives are recognition, justice, and development. Next slide, please. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals was proclaimed same year, 2015, or when they both started the same year, but the 2030 Agenda has much more of an uptake. There are some countries which are leaders in it, like Sweden. Here in Bristol, our mayor and his administration and our city, or I should say the city of Bristol, being a Londoner by birth, has taken on board the 2030 Agenda as a post-COVID response, which I'm proud to say, because I agree. And I advocated to other people to go have a look at the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and you might see why we here in Bristol have managed to fight it off. We're tier 1. Great. Sorry, next slide, please. So SDG target 10.3, to ensure equal opportunity by eliminating discriminatory laws, policies, and practices. That should be a target for all local authorities and public bodies and state parties and other stakeholders. Next slide, please. And that includes, one of the things that I would say about that, Bristol has been a bit of a rebel in that, in terms of the previous slide, 10.3, in that they have actually included LGBTQI people in those discriminatory, the policy shouldn't discriminate against people who are LGBTQI. That is not in the original draft from the UN, but in Bristol's voluntary local review, it is stated that LGBTQI discrimination should be included in that. So yeah, this is one of my favorite targets, and it ties in with I think Hafsa and also the other previous speakers, that there is need for fully disaggregated equality data. So, not only BAME, but people of African descent, not only LGBTQI, but you can break that down into what is going on within the LGBTQI community, not only in terms of the sexual, in terms of the different identities, sexual identities, but in terms of race as well. Because as I said, say for example, the year that I was on the National Lesbian and Gay Steering Committee for the country, I was a Black members officer. We had an Asian members officer, and then the other officers were representing the various geographic regions. So, we have to recognize that there are intersectional, I think Hafsa mentioned that, there are intersectionalities which can, unfortunately, to further vulnerability, further discrimination, etc. Next slide, please. And yeah, that brings me back to the International Decade. So it's recognition, justice, and development. Part of development is taking concrete measures to eliminate racism, etc., etc. You can see from the slide, which ties in with what I said earlier, in terms of 10.3, normative frameworks, that's what we call them, developing normative frameworks through knowledge exchange, through community empowerment, community participation, that can be achieved. I know it can be achieved because of
are you still with us,
okay.
Ado? Are you still with us?
Well, yeah.
We lost you just that last end of your sentence.
Oh, unstable internet connection. It's okay. You can see it's all there on the slide.
Okay.
It's all about experience. It's all about community development, knowledge exchange, and moving forward. Next slide, please. Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, and that's my UNESCO website. Please do click on it. You'll see lots of stuff there. You might get some ideas, you might get some inspiration. You might, want to get back to Alison about stuff. Please do have a look there. Thank you.
Oh, wow, terrific. Thank you very much, Ade. That was brilliant. That was very informative. All of our panel tonight, Saskia, who has actually texted me to say that she got kicked out.
Hello, sorry, I don't know if it's something I said, Alison.
No.
But I'm back. But anyway.
Thank you. I'm really, I have to apologize. Really, I was supposed to be clock watching, and I was so engaged with your deliveries and listening and learning that I completely lost track of time. So we're going to go over by a few minutes. So I apologize for that. But no, Saskia, you were brilliant. Thank you very much. Really informative. Brilliant. Thank you. And Ade, Rob Berkeley, and also Hafsa, who may have gone. She's got a terrible cold today, so she may have gone to get some Lemsip or something.
No, Hafsa sent her apologies in the chat.
She did. I missed that. Thank you. If it's okay with the panel, I mean, thank you all for delivering such informative, passionate, insightful deliveries to us. Great information, some great tips, the sharing your personal experiences as well. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
And there's loads of comments in the chat. I'm not sure if you've been able to see comments of support and lots of thanks as well. If you don't mind, could we spend 10 minutes having a Q&A? Because there have been some questions running through the chat that it would be nice to put to you if you have the time.
Yeah, I can do that. My son's currently happily being on YouTube right now, so he's all right. I've got 10 minutes, go for it.
I might just have to go and answer the door quickly. I'll be back.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Alison, is it possible for me to make a couple of points around language? Could we use the word declare rather than disclosure? Because it's a lot more inclusive. And can we please refer to people who are seeking refuge as people seeking refuge or asylum rather than asylum seeker? The whole conversation was around inclusive language, and I really, really want to make these 2 points.
Perfect.
We're all learning. We're all learning.
So said, so
learning.
done. I did see it in the chat, actually. That's one of the things I was going to bring up. But yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
No problem. So, Doreen is our facilitator. Are you? Brilliant. Hi, Doreen. You've been doing a brilliant job. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Doreen.
You're welcome.
Have you any questions lined up so far? If not, then we can ask people to put their hand up straight away.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of positive feedback, as you can see.
Yes.
There were a couple of questions around networks, but we have already covered that. So
yes, I saw that one.
My question is around the organization. It's called Community Group on Eventbrite. Can you tell us a little bit about who your organization is?
Sojourner Enterprise and the TE Network is a consultancy. I brought them out of my time working as a BME network chair in the NHS. And I was encouraged to do more outside of the healthcare sector with regards to equalities. And specifically around race and discrimination. That's where Sojourner Enterprise and the network have come from. It's something that's really passionate to me, something that's really important to me, and I decided to carry on the work on a voluntary basis and bring it out of that the health sector sector, because there are so many people in public sector jobs, especially as COVID began to take place and take a hold on our communities and on us, on our society. Our lifestyles started changing, but there's still discrimination, and discriminatory practices still seem to come into the mix and further and just make life difficult. So that's really where it came from, and what Sojourner Enterprise and the TE Network are about. We're passionate about equalities, and this event and pulling people together to discuss these challenging issues, these less talked about concerns, is something I'm just compelled to do. So it's part of a service that I'm providing to the community, because I am just passionate about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, so can I, thank you. So can I ask, what is the multiple impact of inequalities at work, considering what we can all do to make a difference? I mean, and I mean a real difference. And I'm going to put that to the panel. All of your mics, I think, are now open. So apart from you, Rob. Can I put that out to the panel, please?
I'm going to do school style, put my hand up, if that's all right. In school. I mean, you know, again, that's quite a broad question, really, but I think the most important thing, the impact that we see on this is around mental health. You know, these inequalities that people are experiencing. So where you impacted when you are part of a marginalised group, or if you are experiencing discrimination, you know, again, whether that's around LGBTQ+, being from BAME community, the effects of not having that, you know, not being included will impact on mental health. But also what you're seeing that as an organisation is around, you know, staff retention. Staff, you know, are they going to give you their best self, really, if they're not feeling supported? And again, you know, so there's some of the impacts. I'm sure I won't go across the board, so I'll let other people jump in as well. But I personally feel, and we see all the time, that mental health is one of the biggest impacts to be affected.
Yeah, I think that's a good point for me to jump in, because it was raised. It has come up in some of the various groups that organizations that I kind of work with as a part of my research into people of African descent and the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I think really, for me, my response is, as I was trying to get across, is this business about community empowerment, community involvement, knowledge exchange. I think it's probably coming from that union background, because that's when I kind of first woke up. Before then, it was, oh, why is this happening to me? You know, I'm walking down the road and, you know, you get somebody say something nasty to you, or, you know, you're in a social setting and, you know, somebody throws a glass of wine in your face, and you know, you sort of, well, why is this happening to me? And it wasn't until I got involved in the union, in trade unionism, that I kind of realized it wasn't just me alone. It was happening to other people. And one of the things of this momentum that we're going through, it's a huge wake-up call around the world of, wow, this is not happening to me alone. You know, that is what has been happening. That's what all these NSARs and what happened in Bristol and in London and everything. It's not me alone. It's not only me alone getting stopped and searched. It's happening in Europe. It's happening in Africa. It's happening in America. It's happening in Latin America. It's terrible. And of course, COVID is bringing it home big time, because we are dying, which none of us have actually mentioned in our presentations or speeches, we are actually dying, especially BME, are dying disproportionately more because of all these microaggressions that we have to live with every day. So yeah, I think it's a time that we do have to take stock. It's 100 years since the Pan-African Congress of, I don't know if this was the one that Garvey or somebody else hosted.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's 100 years, right? And 100 years since the Harlem Renaissance as well. We've got to learn a few lessons from those guys, take stock, reform, and not only for us, but for the next generations as well. Otherwise, yeah.
With that in mind, is there a pressure on LGBT plus QI plus ethnic people to assimilate into whiteness to be accepted? And this is in the workplace, whether they are declaring or not.
I'll go first, and then I'll hopefully Rob will be able to follow on someone else. But I think I'm going first because from the union perspective, that pressure was there. And I think from then I noticed that you did not have to do it. And I think Rob, as a Runnymede Trust, can definitely speak on that.
Yeah, so I mean, I can sense that there's a real tension for LGBT people in the workplace around bringing their whole self to work. Right? So unless you feel safe and psychologically safe, why would you do that? Right? So we get used. Well, I'll speak about me. I would find it easier to code switch than I would to bring my whole self, because I don't know what you do with it if you saw it. I don't know if you could cope, right? So there's a way in which you end up in a kind of guarded position, and that to me is fine. When I hear people ask, ask you to bring your whole self, I'm always a bit dubious, right? And I early on in this pandemic, a lot of people were very saw a Zoom call into their home as being very invasive.
Very true.
And I think that's because they're much more used to having a private space where they can lock off work and keep a different space. And I don't know if that's been completely resolved. And particularly for those people who are marginalised, what are you opening yourself up to when you bring your whole self? I don't think that's necessarily about conforming to whiteness or to any kind of, or anything but keeping your heads down, and that's bad for your work colleagues, because you're not bringing all your talent.
Sorry, but isn't it privacy as well? Isn't it something about privacy? I mean, regardless of whether you're BAME, LGBTQI, POC, or whatever, we all have a right to privacy, and that is something that I think we have to be careful with. Being inclusive should not necessarily mean, everybody can come walking in through my door, which is partly what Zoom is about. Like Saskia.
I say exactly. I mean, it shouldn't be about, you have to, if you're LGBT, it's all about a big glitter party every Zoom board, and that's not it. I think for me, and I know it's slightly digressing of, should it be about whiteness or not, but I think picking up on what Rob said as well, and Ade, about bringing your whole self to work, to me, isn't about disclosing all your private life. It's about that feeling comfortable to wear the clothes that you feel fit. So as a non-binary person or a trans person, wear those clothes that feel you fit, or none. As a person of colour, talk about maybe, and again, I'm just using these as examples, you know, talk about your culture, talk about celebrating Black History Month, talk about my partner as an LGBTQ plus person, talk about, oh, my partner and I are 2 women, we're going through IVF to have our child. You know, it's about that kind of bringing yourself up to feel comfortable, not necessarily disclosing at the weekend, I did A, B, and C. It's about really feeling that you can just, if you want to, and we do see this still a lot, you know, that people feel like they can't talk about their partners or they can't talk about their, and they're using words that slightly hide it and feel like they've got to fit in, and that's what bringing your, you know, true, you know, authenticity shouldn't be. It should be being able to just say it as it is, and I think that's what's important about your true authentic self, or bringing your whole self to work, in my opinion, you know.
Yeah, and I agree. I think there's a you want people to be authentic because you want, well, as an employee, you want the best out of them, and as a colleague, you want to trust them, right? So that's easier if they're authentic. But the expectations aren't. For some people, there's more risk in sharing than there is for others. I think it's just kind of depends on that.
Absolutely, and I think.
Yeah.
And I think that I totally agree with you, and that's why we're having this conversation, because although bringing your authentic self to work is about you being able to be comfortable in what you disclose, we know the fact is that there are still people that for whatever reason can't, and that's where the concern should be, you know, is, and that's why employers should be able to offer that safe space from the start. And that safe space doesn't mean you disclose everything to everybody. It says if you feel that you need support, if you need, you know, to have a conversation about what's happening outside of work or in, then I'm here to support you. You know.
I think it has to also, because you know, when Rob was speaking, I was tempted to use the word age and say, well, you know, probably the generational differences, because my generation had, you know, we went through different things to subsequent generations. But I think it's not only that. I think it's back to what Valerie was saying in my slide. It's actually an individual thing. Each person, you know, you will have people from your generation, Saskia, and from younger generations who may well be LGBTQI, and they may not wish to disclose for whatever reason. They may be happily married and whatever, and they just might not want to. So, I mean, I think really one has got to respect individual, and that's one thing I did say. I did think I did learn also being a part of the trade union movement at that level, is that you do learn, well, just because you're Black and LGBTQ doesn't mean that, oh, it's going to be, no, it doesn't work like that. You know, it's we're all got our own individual personalities, so that is something else that has to be respected.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly not. Nothing is certainly a one size fits all
No.
across the board, is it? And it is all about how you feel as an individual, and you know, how confident you feel, what support you have, and what you wish to talk about and disclose in that respect.
And yet respecting the difference, respecting those differences as well.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Wow. Okay, I think we have to call this to an end. We've gone over by 20
minutes. This fantastic question that maybe we should, that, is it Lily?
It's just come in, sorry. Go ahead. Please go ahead.
I'm not sure what the answer is, but I thought.
Oh, okay then. Let's have a look. I really want to educate myself as much as possible for practical advice. Hi everyone. I am an employment specialist in mental health, secondary care. I'm watching this interesting event, especially because of tomorrow. I will be supporting the start of employment and well-being support for my first LGBTQI client. Any advice on how to approach her? She is a trans, addressed as she. Thank you, Lily. I'll put that out to who would like to go first with that. Saskia.
No comment.
No, sorry, I'm just quickly reading. I will be supporting the start of employment and wellbeing support for my first LGBTQI client. I mean, well, if they're open, this is an important thing. Don't assume when you're speaking to anyone from the, as an example, from LGBTQ+ community, right? So if you've put the pronouns, you've said that they're trans, I'm assuming then they're open about their gender identity, which is great. So in that, it's about you then making sure that you are obviously using the correct pronouns, showing empathy, showing respect, showing kindness, the confidence that will have in that individual as the very start will set the tone for the future of them in employment. And I guess seeing that support, I'm just quickly reading the rest of the you want to educate yourself, don't put pressure on yourself. If you get things wrong at this point, if it's coming from a good place, that's okay, as long as it's not a regular thing. So often people say about pronouns, oh, sorry, I said your pronouns and I said the wrong ones, I'm sorry about that. And they kind of laugh off. No, we know when it's, once, twice you can be forgiven, but you have to make a conscious effort, to show that respect. So don't put pressure on yourself, but as long as you are actively trying to educate and make change, then I think that goes a long way. And if your client, if that person is open about their gender identity, if you have questions, I've not met a trans person yet who is open about their gender identity, who, if they can see that person is trying to support them or be, positive, that they are not open to any questions. So like I say, if it's coming from a good place, then don't be afraid to ask. But obviously respectful within that, asking about what are your pronouns, asking, I don't mean ask, have you had surgery or that kind of thing, because I don't want that to be, because people will, take that and run with it. But what I mean is ask about the pronouns, ask about, well, that's it, yeah, mainly ask about the pronouns at this point. Go with it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
That's brilliant. Yes, thanks everybody. Oh, I forgot to say earlier on, I've been prompted that at Sojourner Enterprise, we offer a range of services, including helping people to set up networks. We do equality impact assessments. We have a number of support services and resources available. So you can always contact the TE Network or contact sojournerenterprise.com if you would like to know more. Okay, the door is always open. This is something that I'm very passionate about, and I'm really, really delighted to have been able to deliver this event this evening with this great panel of experts to share this knowledge and support with you all. Thank you, everybody from the panel and all the participants as well. Thank you, everybody in the chat room. I hope that there have been some relationships made there in terms of support for each other. Do keep in touch with Sojourner Enterprise and all of the organizations represented here today and the individuals. We will be sending out a resource pack with the slides and some accompanying documents, supporting papers on the panel members and their work. So please look out for that coming through your email, and I'll be using the same email address that was used when you booked your ticket.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Alison, as well, for putting this great event together and asking us to all come on board. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Alison. Excellent. Great to see you, Rob.
Great to catch up. Nice one.
Yeah.
And thank you, everybody.
Good luck with the research.
Cheers. I may need it.
You'll do it. You're doing a great job, Rob.
Cool.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
And thank you, Doreen, our facilitator.
Thank you, Doreen.
Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you. Take care. I've put my details also in the chat. My website's under construction. Slight plug towards the end. Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you, Saskia. Good night. Good night. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night. Thank you.